Now for the sink, we're going to use dynamic brushes to kind of do some cool effects. But first, let's go ahead and pick some materials for it. Now I'm just going to kind of be a little lazy here and use some smart materials. That is, of course, the strength of Substance Painter, so we might as well take advantage. I'm going to go with a copper sink, and they have copper and copper worn. I want more of kind of a warm looking copper, so I'm going to go ahead, grab that warm copper and see just how extreme some of those kind of grunge effects are. Now I don't necessarily want the grunge to be on this level, so we can go ahead and look at the different options we have here and where that may be coming from. It looks like the worn surface is kind of where most of that's coming from. So if we click here on the mask editor, we can look at the mask there and see how extreme that is. And first of all, I'm going to grab this layer, scroll up, and I'm going to change this to triplanar. And then I'm going to grab here, click the mask editor. Need to scroll to the top of the mask editor there. We're going to add a little bit of global blur. We don't necessarily want that harsh of a detail. Maybe turn down the global balance there and some of the texture. So if I come in here, I can see that the worn surface is what's causing most of the issues. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of that because that's not even really the kind of look I want to go for. I don't want it to quite be that old. So this kind of roughness imperfections will do. So let's come down in here and we can go ahead and kind of paint some more of our own. So first of all, I'm going to give this a different look down here. So let's choose another color so we can go, and this may not necessarily be the most realistic, but I kind of want just a darker kind of whiter metal in there, something without color. So we'll grab this steel stained, add a black mask, and then you can probably use the object fill there. And if you want, you can go ahead and fill in that copper there. If we were being meticulous, we'd go ahead and paint that out for the final project. But for the sake of time, that's not the focus of this piece. I'm going to move on to the dynamic brushes. So the cool thing about the dynamic brushes is that they shoot particles at your object. So to use a particle brush, we're going to create a new kind of basic layer, not a fill layer there. And let's call this water drip damage. If I come down here into my brush settings, I'm going to set an obnoxious color just so you can kind of see how these brushes work. So if we come down in here and we see, let's take this broken glass, and if we click, you can see it hits that with particles and then spreads out in a manner that mimics broken glass. Here you can see how we have these kind of like burn effects and how they're kind of moving up like that, like it's almost burning up from the bottom. And there's all different ones here. We're going to be using leaks. The rain and puddle are really cool. The veins are really cool, especially if you're doing characters. You can see how it kind of creates creepy little veins. And this is called the physical paintbrush, which you can access from under here from just using other paint if you want to create your own. But when you create the physical paintbrush, you can actually come up here and you have all these various options that you can set for the brush. So if you come down here to attributes and you have all these physics and emitters and particle life and particle speed. And a lot of these are self-explanatory if you're familiar with any particle system, and they kind of describe themselves pretty well. So they're easy to follow along with. And with those, you can kind of adjust the particle. Now, most of the time I just stick with the presets here and I might tweak one or two parameters there, but oftentimes I find that these are good enough. And if you have the regular paintbrush clicked, you can just also access these by clicking these. You don't have to get the physical brush. Let's go ahead and let's delete that layer. Let's create another layer there, and we'll just again call this water drip damage. And let's kind of play with our parameters down here. So we don't need a height for this layer. Make sure I have this one selected here. We do not need a color for this layer. We do not need height, and we do not need normal. We're just going to be painting into kind of the metallic paint and the roughness there. So for the roughness, let's go ahead and bump this up a bit. We'll bump that up a little over 5. And for the metallic, we're currently set to 0, which this copper is going to be set to 1. So let's go ahead and maybe set that to around 0.9. We don't want anything extreme there. And let's grab one of this leaks, and just kind of give ourselves an idea what it's going to look like if we paint in there. We can see that that's kind of giving us kind of a water leak on the side. And then if we want to come up here, we have a lot more options depending on which preset you check here. So here we kind of have the global wind, X, Y, gravity factor, initial velocity, particle life, and you can go ahead and change that. I'm going to turn the particle life random up so that when I paint across, it'll give us a little bit more of a variety. And with that selected, I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger, and then I'm just going to shoot a couple particles there and around there. And what we're just kind of do is kind of create a little bit of the illusion that because this has been used so much, that the kind of water has kind of corroded or worn out there. And we can come up to the water damage here. And if we scroll down, we can actually add color if we want. And because this is a paint layer, remember that we kind of just continually add on. It's not like a fill layer locked into one thing. We can maybe add just a little bit of darkness there and see what that looks like. Maybe not that much. Let's go ahead, color pick maybe this copper color here. If you want to kind of add some of that corrosion back in that we removed earlier, I'm fine without it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the sandstorm here, and you can kind of see how the particles there work and how they kind of splat around. So I'm just going to add a little bit of splatter there. And then to kind of soften up some of this, I'm going to come to my brushes, and I kind of like this cement brush. I think that's going to do a good job. I don't want my flow to be too high there, but I do want to turn it up a little bit because it's kind of down from before. Let's go ahead, just kind of paint in around some of these edges because we don't necessarily want those dots there. And there we go. So I feel like that kind of gives us a little bit kind of a water damage edge. Now, if we come down to the bottom, so let's go ahead and we can maybe kind of desaturate this a bit. And if we come up to all, we can look up spots. And usually there's these kind of like dirt spots. So if you want, you can go ahead and grab one of these, and that is a brush there. So we can grab that brush, maybe scale that up, and maybe click like once or twice in there and just kind of create a few water spots on the bottom. We have grunge stain spots. That'd be a good one to use. Maybe put a couple more directly under this nozzle here. And then let's look for a material for the handle. So maybe a marble would work, kind of more of a marble handle. We have these marble polished. So I'm going to grab this marble polished here. Add a black mask. Go ahead, click that one and click that one. And with that, I'm pretty happy with kind of like the base sink there. Now, if I was doing this for myself, like I said, I'd paint this out a bit more, play with that rim more, and maybe kind of add some grunge and things there. But we've already kind of walked you through a lot of those techniques. So let's go ahead and move on. So we can add maybe the kind of matching marble polish to our jar here. So let's just go ahead and add that, make sure that looks good. And this is a smart material. So yeah, it kind of took into account there. We should be good to go using that. So we can go ahead, turn back on everything here. And let's go ahead and take a look at this in iRay. Now, I do want to take note one more time that if I was going to improve this, I'd probably clean up the back end a bit. I'd add a little bit of wear and tear to the faucets here, and I'd play with the curvature parameters on the cabinets a bit more to get it to match our previous cabinets, and I'd play with the scale so that the scale of kind of like the flannel was uniform across the entire scene. But for the sake of moving forward and not retreading familiar ground, I'm going to go ahead and walk you through some kind of iRay settings. So as we mentioned before and kind of briefly showed when we were trying to show how to do the glass shader, you can create multiple shaders up here, and you can export those shader instances as the export as we showed. But for the most part, you're going to use them here in the software. And unless if you're doing glass or skin or hair or something, but when you're doing a lot of these kind of like generic surfaces like this, I find that it's usually okay just to stay on one shader. And iRay is good for getting a preview of what your image might look like in a render engine, or if you're strictly a texturing artist and you don't want to go to a 3D application, you can go along and kind of finalize that render here in Substance Painter. So as before, we kind of access that by clicking that button up here, and whatever layer you have selected, if you have multiple shaders, it's going to use that shader as kind of a default there. Now, the movement controls in iRay are the same movements as the ones here in the OpenGL 3D viewport. So it should be pretty familiar to kind of move around. And it is going to take a bit longer to load this scene because this is a heavier object, as we've mentioned before. So if you're kind of struggling with that, maybe do it with a simpler object or turn off some. And you can see kind of right out of the gate, things already look pretty great. But let's look at some of these parameters and how we can go ahead and dial those in.